What the heck is cut bait? Where do I buy it? How do I make it? I've received many variations of these questions over the years, and in this video I am not only going to answer those questions, but give you some important tips about using cut bait. While there is no wrong way to use cut bait, there are some important things to keep in mind that will give you better performance from the bait you have. First, cut bait is basically any fish that you cut up into pieces. While that sounds simple, and once you do it, you'll realize that it is, for someone new to fishing, they may think there is a right or wrong way to do it. The most basic way to cut up your bait, and I'll show you some options on this later on in the video, is to cut it up into 3 or 4 equal parts. The first thing I do before I get started, I scale my fish. You don't have to remove every scale from the fish like you're cooking it, but knocking most of them off will help you do 2 things. First, it eliminates those loose, pesky scales that can get on the tip of your hook and prevent you from hooking up. The second thing is, I think it helps with scent dispersion. Opening up that skin allows more of the juices from the fish to spread out into the water column. Now once you cut that fish up, you're going to have a head section, a tail section, and then 2 to 3 middle pieces. Now the one twist to that is if you get an extremely large piece of bait, then you can have multiple midsection pieces. In my opinion, out of all of the pieces you've got so far, the head is probably the best piece of bait. After all, it's the only section with eyes, and I believe those eyes have some secret attraction that fish are drawn to. I don't know what it is, but once those eyes are gone from that piece of bait, fish don't seem to bite it as much. Generally speaking, I will use a head piece as long as it has eyes in it. So as soon as those eyes are gone, it's probably time to chunk it. For the head pieces, I like going up through the bottom jaw and out the top. This seems to give a good hook presentation, and it's very unlikely that the main part of the bait will roll into the hook. The other great thing about hooking a head piece this way is it pulls the mouth shut. If you do not go through the bottom jaw and just through the top or another part of the head, that mouth can open up and create a little parachute in the water that can pull and twist and tumble your bait. Next, you have the middle section, and these pieces are loaded with scent. Now when you cut out one of these midsections, especially around the gut pocket area, a lot of people will cut out that gut pocket section. The belief is that this area is similar to that open mouth on a head piece of bait, and it will cause the piece of bait to tumble. Now me personally, I rarely do this unless I'm in heavy current. But if it makes you feel more comfortable, it's not going to hurt anything, do it. Another trick with cut bait, especially with these midsection pieces, is when you run that hook through the piece of bait, run it through at a 45-degree angle. Again, check that hook tip for scales. Those scales can prevent you from catching a fish. Now the last piece you got left is the tail section. What do I do with that? I chunk it in the water. I don't know what it is about the tail section. Maybe it's just because it's small, but I don't have a lot of luck with it. Now some people swear by it, some people use it, and if it's all the bait you got left, go ahead and use it. It's not that big of a deal. Me personally, I throw it in the water. I'm not a fan of using the tail section, but if it's the last piece you got, I'd keep it. Now another option you can do with cut bait is filleting it. Doing it this way will still give you the head section, but filleting off the meat off the side of the fish will give you a elongated piece of bait that may look like a bait fish swimming in the water that you're fishing. And because that one side is exposing all of the meat and flesh that is against the backbone, you get a lot of scent dispersion. The other thing you can do with that fillet is, once it's off, cut it up into smaller pieces. Now there are some fish that are better suited for filleting than others. Smaller gizzard shad are not a good one to use. Generally speaking, these smaller gizzard shad have very thin skin and the bait will tear off the hook easily. Now once you get into some of the larger gizzard shad, the ones that are over 12 inches long, their skin is a bit thicker and you can use it as a filleted piece of bait. Now if you're able to use game fish like bass and bluegill where you're at, those fish make excellent fillet baits. Filleting a fish takes a little bit of practice. Don't worry, you're going to butcher up the first few that you try. But remember, this isn't for the dinner table or the fish market. This is for bait. So give it a shot. A little bit of practice, you'll figure it out. Now, some people will ask, how long should you leave a piece of bait in the water before swamping it out? Well, if you ask 5 different anglers that question, you'll get 10 different answers. For me personally, I have no problem letting a bait sit for 45 minutes to an hour if I'm anchored up. In my opinion, I would rather have that bait sit there, give the fish time to find it, than to reel it in every 10 or 15 minutes and put on a new piece of bait. My rule of thumb is, as long as I'm catching fish on a piece of bait, I'll keep it on the hook. As for what is the best cut bait, as I've said in many videos, gizzard shad are hard to beat. They're widespread pretty much in any waters that hold catfish in America. Catfish anglers anywhere in the country love them, but there is one downside. You got to catch gizzard shad in a cast net if you're not buying them from a bait store. For many people, throwing a cast net can be intimidating and possibly impractical depending on where you're fishing. Now, another one of the great cut baits out there that people love, especially on the Mississippi drainages, is skipjack herring. You don't need a net to catch skipjack, but you do need to be able to cast a jig, retrieve it, and catch them on rod and reel. Skipjack are an oily fish that catfish and striped bass love to eat when cut up into chunks. Now, as I said earlier, they're native to the drainages of the Mississippi River, so you guys east of the Appalachian Mountains and way far north in some of the catfish areas may not have them. Now, the last one I'll discuss is the one that I think is probably the easiest and most accessible to most anglers that are fishing from the bank, and that's sunfish. Now, granted, there are some states where sunfish, also known as bluegill and brim, are not legal to use, so check your local regulations. But if you can use them, they're very easy to find and relatively easy to catch during the right time of the year. Generally speaking, once temperatures warm up in the 60s, you can catch these fish on rod and reel. The good news for bank anglers is, most of the time, they're right near the bank. The cool thing about bluegill and brim is that, well, you can start out using them as live bait if you're fishing for flatheads or want to give live bait a try. And then, as the baits die on the hook, you can turn them into cut bait. One thing to keep in mind in all of this, folks, is, as I said earlier, there is not an exact right and wrong thing to do here. Sometimes anglers spend too much time stressing over little things that really don't make a difference in catching fish. How exactly you cut the bait or how exactly you hook it really is not going to make that big of a difference in whether a fish wants to eat that bait or not. No matter what you do, no matter what bait you have, no matter how you cut it or how you hook it, if fish aren't feeding, they're not going to hit your bait. So in the end, take all this information, apply it as you can in your situation, and just get out there and fish.